Invisibility isn't something you are born with. It is something you learn. It is a slow, quiet process like dust settling on a piece of furniture in a room no one ever uses. You don't notice it happening day by day, but eventually you look in the mirror and realize your edges have blurred. You have become an expert at taking up as little space as possible. My name is Mael. If you're listening from somewhere far away, drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this has traveled. And please, stay with me until the end. To understand how you become a ghost in your own home, you have to understand the house itself. I grew up in a picturesque upper middle class neighborhood in Pennsylvania. The kind of street where the lawns are manicured with military precision, where neighbors wave from their driveways, and where keeping up appearances isn't just a hobby, it's a blood sport. My father, Quentin Bishop, owned a mid-sized construction company. To the outside world, he was the picture of local success. He drove a pristine truck, sponsored the local Little League teams, and always picked up the tab at the country club dinners. But behind the heavy oak door of our home, the reality was a suffocating, terrifying house of cards. Quentin's company was almost always drowning in debt. He took out loans to pay off other loans, leveraging equipment he didn't fully own to bid on contracts he couldn't afford to lose. The stress radiated off him in waves, smelling of stale coffee and cheap antacids. My mother, Larissa, was the ultimate architect of our family's illusion. For her, reality was entirely optional. Perception was the only currency that mattered. She spent her days managing our public image with the ruthless efficiency of a PR executive. Every family Christmas card was perfectly color coordinated. Every PTA bake sale was an opportunity to prove our domestic superiority. She lived in a constant, quiet terror that the neighbors might peek behind the curtains and see the financial rot eating away at our foundation. And then there was Hayes. My younger brother was born 3 years after me, and from the moment he could hold a plastic bat, he wasn't just a son, he was a life raft. Hayes was genuinely gifted at baseball, a natural athlete with a golden arm. But in the Bishop household, his talent wasn't allowed to just be a childhood passion. It was an investment. As Quentin's business fluctuated from bad to worse, Hayes became the family's singular focus, the golden ticket out of the financial hole Quentin had dug. A full-ride Division I athletic scholarship wasn't just a hope. It was a mandatory requirement for our family's survival. Because of this, all of our family's emotional and financial oxygen was pumped directly into Hayes' lungs. Private pitching coaches, elite travel leagues, $400 titanium bats, and weekend-long tournaments spanning across the East Coast. No expense was spared. If the construction company had a good month, the money went to Hayes. If the company had a terrible month, Quentin simply put the expenses on a credit card. You have to spend money to make money, my father would say, watching Hayes pitch from the bleachers. Where did that leave me? It left me as the ultimate convenience, the low-maintenance child. My parents didn't hate me. Hate requires passion, focus, and energy. What they felt for me was a profound, comfortable indifference. They viewed me as a safe asset that required absolutely zero maintenance. I was the child who didn't cause trouble, who got straight A's without being asked, and who never demanded expensive equipment or cross-country road trips. At first, I thought my independence would earn their respect. I thought if I could just be perfect, if I could just eliminate every burden I might place on them, they would finally look at me and say, "We are so proud of you." I learned very early on how incredibly wrong I was. By the time I was in high school, my invisibility was an established law of physics within our household. When I made the honor roll, Larissa would give it a distracted nod before rushing back to washing Hayes' uniforms. When I was nominated for a state-level debate tournament, Quentin told me I'd need to find a ride because he had to drive Hayes to a scouting showcase in Ohio. "You're so capable, sweetie, my mother would say, patting my shoulder absent-mindedly. "Hayes needs us right now. The pressure on him is just immense. You know how to take care of yourself." You know how to take care of yourself. If I had $1 for every time I heard that phrase, I wouldn't have needed the 3 part-time jobs I worked just to survive. That phrase was their universal get-out-of-jail-free card. It absolved them of every forgotten birthday, every missed school play, and every dinner where I sat in silence while they analyzed every single pitch of Hayes' last game. They weaponized my resilience against me, turning my ability to survive into an excuse to neglect me. When it came time for college, the reality of my position in the family hit me with the force of a freight train. I had been accepted into a fantastic university, a state school with a highly competitive business program. I had naively left the acceptance letter on the kitchen island, hoping for a celebration. It sat there for 2 days before getting pushed under a stack of utility bills. When I finally brought up the topic of tuition, Quentin didn't even look up from his ledger. "You'll have to figure out the loan situation," he said flatly. "With the economy the way it is, and Hayes needing to attend the elite summer showcase in Florida. We just don't have the liquidity to help you right now, but you've always been smart with money. You'll figure it out." I didn't cry. Crying was a luxury for people who had someone to comfort them. Instead, I went to the local library, sat at a public computer, and began the brutal process of navigating the federal student loan system alone at 17 years old. That was the period of my life where I developed a skill that would later change my destiny. I learned how to read the fine print. When you are young, broke, and entirely unsupported, signing your life away to a lender is terrifying. I didn't have a wealthy father's lawyer to review the documents. I didn't have a financially literate mother to explain interest capitalization or amortization schedules. I only had myself. I spent hours reading the dense, deliberately confusing legal jargon of loan agreements. I learned to spot the traps, the variable interest rates disguised as introductory offers, the hidden fees, the clauses that stripped away your rights if you missed a single payment. I trained my brain to see the worst-case scenario hidden in the margins. I had to, because no one was going to catch me if I fell. College was a grueling marathon of exhaustion. While my peers were joining sororities, studying abroad, and spending their parents' money at campus bars, I was living a dual life. By day, I was a dedicated business administration major, keeping a 3.9 GPA. By night, I was a waitress at a diner off the highway, smelling of stale grease and cheap coffee. On weekends, I worked the front desk at the university library, using the quiet hours to finish my coursework. I lived on a diet of ramen noodles, adrenaline, and a desperate, burning desire to prove my family wrong. I thought that if I could just cross that graduation stage with top honors, completely self-made, the sheer, undeniable weight of my achievement would force them to finally see me. I thought they would have no choice but to look at the capable, independent woman I had become and realize the terrible mistake they had made by ignoring me. It's heartbreaking, really, how long that inner child survives, still hoping for a scrap of validation. Which brings us to a crisp, unseasonably warm Saturday in May. Graduation day. I woke up at 5 a.m. because my body was so used to opening the diner for the breakfast shift that it couldn't sleep in, even on the most important day of my life. I ironed my cheap polyester graduation gown in the cramped apartment I shared with 3 other girls. I pinned my cap into my hair, staring at my reflection in the cracked bathroom mirror. I looked exhausted, older than my 22 years, but there was a spark in my eyes. Today was the day. I had mailed my parents the engraved invitations 3 months in advance. I had called my mother the week prior, and she had given a vague, non-committal, "We'll do our best to be there, sweetie. The traffic is just so unpredictable." But I held on to hope. It was my college graduation. Surely this was the line they wouldn't cross. Surely this warranted a few hours of their time. I arrived at the university auditorium early. The air was buzzing with the electric energy of proud families. Everywhere I looked, I saw parents adjusting their children's collars, grandmothers holding bouquets of expensive flowers, and fathers holding up expensive cameras to capture the moment. The auditorium smelled of hairspray, expensive perfume, and overwhelming pride. I found my seat in the alphabetical rows and checked my phone. It was 9:15 a.m. The ceremony started at 10. Nothing. At 9:45 a.m., the auditorium doors were closed and the seating areas were packed to the brim. I looked up at the balcony, scanning the sea of faces for Larissa's blonde hair or Quentin's familiar scowl. Nothing. My phone buzzed in my lap. My heart leaped into my throat. I unlocked the screen, my hands trembling slightly. It was a text from my mother. Decided to go to Hayes' regional semifinal. The scouts from Penn State are there today. Quentin says it's make or break for his scholarship. Graduations are so long and boring anyway. You can handle this yourself, sweetie. So proud of you. Take pictures. I sat there staring at the glowing screen as the university marching band began to play Pomp and Circumstance. The words blurred together. Decided to go to Hayes' regional semifinal. You can handle this yourself. I didn't feel angry right away. I felt a cold, hollow numbness spread from the center of my chest, slowly paralyzing my limbs. It was the absolute finality of it, the undeniable, empirical proof that I did not matter. I was competing with a regional semifinal baseball game, and I had lost. When my name was called, Mael Bishop, summa cum laude, I stood up. I walked across the stage. I took the leather-bound diploma holder from the dean. I smiled for the official photographer, a perfect, practiced, empty smile. From the audience, there was polite, scattered clapping from strangers. No air horns, no screaming my name. Just the quiet rustle of a crowd waiting for the next person on the list. After the ceremony, the campus lawns turned into a massive, joyful chaos of family reunions and photo ops. I navigated through the crowds like a ghost walking through walls. No one noticed me. I made it to the outer edges of the student parking lot, finding my dented 10-year-old Honda Civic baking in the afternoon sun. I got inside, shut the door, and the silence of the car wrapped around me. I didn't take off my cap and gown. I just gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles turning white, staring out the dusty windshield. I was officially a college graduate. I had survived. I was free. But I had never felt more entirely, devastatingly alone. I needed an anchor. I needed to remind myself that I had a future, a plan to escape the suffocating state and move to New York City. I pulled out my phone again. My parents hadn't called, of course. No missed voicemails. But I had something else to look forward to. My Aunt Helen, my mother's older sister, a woman who lived in Oregon and had always been the black sheep of the family for refusing to play Larissa's image games, had sent me a card a week ago. Inside was a handwritten note telling me how proud she was of my grit and a check for $2,000. For your move to New York, the note had read, don't let them keep you here. I had deposited the check into my bank account the moment I received it. That $2,000 was my security deposit. It was my subway fare. It was the only safety net I had ever been given in my entire life. Sitting in the sweltering heat of the Honda, I opened my banking app just wanting to look at the number. I needed the visual comfort of those 4 digits to remind me that tomorrow I could start packing my life into boxes and leave Pennsylvania forever. The app loaded. The little circle spun on the screen. Checking account balance, $14.50. I blinked. I rubbed my eyes, thinking the glare from the sun was playing tricks on me. I refreshed the screen. Checking account balance, $14.50. Panic, sharp and icy, pierced through the numbness in my chest. My breath caught. I quickly tapped into the transaction history, my thumb slipping on the glass screen. Pending. There it was. A transaction from the previous evening at 6 p.m. Withdrawal, $2,000. Transferred to Q. Bishop. Primary checking. The world outside my car window seemed to stop spinning. The cheering families in the distance faded into a muted, underwater hum. When I was 16, I needed a bank account to deposit my paychecks from the diner. Because I was a minor, the bank required a parent to be a co-signer on the account. Quentin had grumbled about the inconvenience, but had gone down to the branch with me, signed his name on the dotted line, and attached his primary account to mine for easy monitoring. Over the years, as I turned 18 and then 21, I had simply forgotten he was still technically on the account. He had never touched my waitress money. I was so self-sufficient that the administrative detail had completely slipped my mind. Until yesterday. I clicked on the transfer details, my vision blurring with hot, stinging tears. But they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of pure, unadulterated shock. Why would Quentin need exactly $2,000 on a Friday evening? And then the memory hit me. 2 weeks ago, at one of the rare dinners where our schedules aligned, Hayes had been complaining bitterly about a premier invitation-only summer baseball camp in Florida, the kind of camp where Major League Scouts practically lived. It's $2,000 just for the registration fee, Hayes had whined, pushing his food around his plate, plus flights and hotel. Dad, if I don't go to this, I'm invisible to the SEC schools. Quentin had looked stressed, massaging his temples. We're tapped out, Hayes. The cement supplier just raised his rates. I don't have $2,000 in liquid cash lying around. Larissa had chimed in, her voice shrill with anxiety. Quentin, he has to go. This is his future. Our future. Find the money. Find the money. Sitting in my graduation gown, suffocating in the heat of my cheap car, the puzzle pieces snapped together with a violent, sickening click. They didn't just decide my graduation was less important than a regional semifinal. They had looked at their accounts, realized they were entirely broke, and Quentin had remembered his name was still tied to the account of his capable, independent daughter. He had seen Aunt Helen's check clear. He had seen the exact amount Hayes needed. And without a phone call, without an explanation, without a shred of hesitation, he had simply taken it. He hadn't just neglected me, he had robbed me. He had taken my security deposit, my escape route, my single lifeline to a new life, and handed it to the golden child so he could throw a ball in the Florida sun. They truly believed that because I could survive anything, I deserved to be sacrificed for the family's image. They thought I would just put my head down, pick up extra shifts at the diner, figure it out, and never say a word. Because that's what I had always done. I stared at the $14.50 on my phone screen. For 22 years, I had lived in the shadow of the Bishop family's glass house. I had twisted myself into knots, trying to be invisible so I wouldn't shatter their fragile reality. I had accepted their neglect because I thought it was my burden to bear. But sitting there, staring at the theft of my future, the last remaining thread of my desperate need for their approval snapped. The sad, hopeful girl who had waited all morning for her parents to walk through the auditorium doors was gone. She evaporated in the heat of that parking lot. In her place, something else woke up. Something cold, precise, and razor sharp. They wanted me to be completely independent? Fine. They were about to learn exactly what my independence looked like when it was no longer serving them. Most people, when robbed by their own parents, would pick up the phone. They would scream, they would demand answers, hurl accusations, and shatter the fragile peace of the household with the righteous fury of a victim. I sat in my sweltering Honda Civic for 2 hours after discovering the missing $2,000, my finger hovering over my father's contact name on my phone, Quentin. I played the inevitable conversation out in my head. I knew exactly how it would go. Quentin would sigh heavily, an exasperated sound designed to make me feel like I was being unreasonable for caring about money when the family was in crisis. He would use words like liquidity, cash flow, and temporary reallocation. Larissa would snatch the phone and weaponize my own competence against me. Mael, please don't be dramatic. Hayes' entire future is riding on this Florida showcase. You already have your degree. You're so smart, you'll easily find a way to make it work. We are a family. We have to sacrifice for each other. But the sacrifices in the Bishop family only ever flowed in one direction. If I called them, I would be participating in their delusion. I would be offering them the chance to justify their theft. I would be asking them to care, and the most humiliating thing in the world is begging for love from people who have already priced out your worth. I didn't press call. I slowly lowered my phone, locked the screen, and placed it in the passenger seat. The crushing, hollow numbness in my chest began to harden. It crystallized into something cold, heavy, and impenetrable. It was clarity. For 22 years, I had been an unpaid supporting actress in the Quentin and Larissa Bishop production. I had accepted my role as the invisible background character, believing that if I simply caused no problems, I would eventually be rewarded with a seat at the table. But the money Quentin took wasn't just currency. It was the absolute, undeniable proof that to them, I wasn't a daughter. I was a piggy bank. I was a resource to be tapped when the golden child required funding. I turned the key in the ignition. The engine sputtered and roared to life, the cheap air conditioning blasting lukewarm air against my tear-stained face. As I drove out of the university parking lot, leaving the cheering families and the flying graduation caps in the rearview mirror, I made a silent vow. I was never going to ask them for anything ever again. Not for money, not for an explanation, and certainly not for their love. But a vow doesn't pay rent in New York City. The reality of my situation was stark. I had $14.50 to my name. Moving to Manhattan, a city that chewed up and spat out people with full savings accounts, was mathematically impossible. I couldn't just pack my bags and dramatically storm out. I had to be strategic. I had to do what I had always done: survive. I spent the summer following my graduation living like a machine. I begged the landlord of my college apartment to let me extend my lease month by month, sleeping on an air mattress after my roommates moved out. I picked up every available shift at the Highway Diner, trading my graduation gown for an apron stained with cherry pie filling and cheap coffee. When I wasn't waitressing, I was doing freelance transcription work online, typing until my fingers cramped and my vision blurred. I worked 80-hour weeks. I ate rice, beans, and the discarded dinner rolls from the diner. I became a ghost haunting my own life. During those grueling 3 months, my interactions with my family were a masterclass in detachment. Quentin and Larissa would occasionally call, never to ask how my post-grad job hunt was going, but usually to complain about the cost of Hayes' new pitching coach or the traffic on the way to his tournaments. "How are things, sweetie?" Larissa would ask, the clinking of ice in her evening cocktail audible through the speaker. "Fine, Mom, just working," I would reply, my voice perfectly level, devoid of any inflection. That's my capable girl. "Listen, your father is so stressed about the regional finals." I let them talk. I offered appropriate, non-committal hums. I didn't mention the stolen $2,000. I didn't mention that I was working myself to the bone. I realized that my silence was the greatest camouflage I could possibly wear. They were so consumed by their own financial panic and their obsession with Hayes' athletic career that they didn't even notice the absolute void where their daughter used to be. They assumed my quietness was just my usual low-maintenance nature. They didn't know it was the sound of me building a brick wall between us, one cinder block at a time. By mid-August, through sheer, punishing discipline, I had managed to scrape together $4,000. It was barely enough for a security deposit on a closet-sized room in Queens and a month of groceries, but it was enough to start. However, before I could leave Pennsylvania, there was one piece of administrative housekeeping I needed to handle. It was the most important step of my entire plan. I couldn't go to New York as Maelle Bishop. The name Bishop felt like a heavy, suffocating wool coat soaked in winter rain. It belonged to a family that saw me as expendable. It was tied to a joint checking account that had been plundered. It was the name of a girl who waited in parking lots for parents who never showed up. If I was going to reinvent myself in the most unforgiving city in the world, I needed to sever the final cord. I needed to legally murder the invisible girl. I spent hours researching the legal name change process in my state. It required a background check, fingerprinting, a mountain of paperwork, a publication in a local legal journal, and a court hearing. It was tedious, and it cost nearly $300 in administrative fees, money I desperately needed for New York. But I paid it without a second thought. It was an investment in my own psychological survival. Choosing a new name was the easiest part. I chose Callahan. Callahan was my maternal grandmother's maiden name. She had passed away when I was 6 years old, but my memories of her were the only warm, untainted fragments of my childhood. She was the only person who had ever looked at me and actually seen me. I remembered her sitting in the sunroom of our old house, slipping me butterscotch candies and telling me, "You have quiet eyes, Maelle. The quiet ones are the ones who end up running the world. They just don't announce it." Maelle Callahan. It sounded sharp. It sounded professional. It sounded like a woman who didn't take orders, who didn't apologize for taking up space, and who certainly didn't let anyone steal from her. My court date was on a dreary, overcast Tuesday morning. I wore a thrifted navy blazer and a pair of slacks I had aggressively ironed the night before. I sat in the polished wooden pews of the county courthouse, clutching a manila folder containing my entire life's documentation, when the judge, a stern-looking man with silver hair and reading glasses perched on the end of his nose, called my case. I stepped up to the podium. My palms were sweating, but my posture was rigid, my spine made of steel. "You are petitioning to change your legal surname from Bishop to Callahan," the judge said, looking down at the paperwork. "Are you attempting to evade debt, legal prosecution, or any contractual obligations?" "No, Your Honor," I said clearly. "And what is your reason for this request, Ms. Bishop?" I looked up at the state seal hanging behind his head. I thought about the graduation auditorium. I thought about the $14.50 in my bank account. I thought about Quentin's pristine construction trucks and Larissa's perfect Christmas cards. "I am starting a new professional chapter in another state, Your Honor," I said, my voice steady, betraying absolutely none of the earthquake happening in my chest. "I wish to honor my late grandmother's lineage as I build my career. The Bishop name no longer reflects who I am or who I intend to be." The judge looked at me over his glasses. For a fraction of a second, I wondered if he could see the bruised, neglected child hiding inside the thrifted blazer. But then he simply nodded, picked up his heavy rubber stamp, and brought it down on the thick stack of papers with a resonant thud. "Petition granted. Good luck in your new chapter, Ms. Callahan." I walked out of the courthouse and into the gray morning air, clutching the certified decree. I took a deep breath. The air actually tasted different. It felt lighter in my lungs. I went straight to the Social Security office, then the DMV, and finally to a new bank, one where Quentin Bishop had absolutely no jurisdiction. By 3 p.m., Maelle Bishop was legally dead. That evening, I drove to my parents' house for the final time. I knew their schedule perfectly. It was a Thursday. Hayes was at a regional scouting combine 3 hours away, and Quentin had driven him. Larissa had her weekly women's auxiliary wine night at the country club, a sacred ritual where she went to pretend our family wasn't drowning in debt. The house would be completely empty. I parked my Civic a block away, not wanting the engine noise to alert any nosy neighbors. I walked up the perfectly manicured driveway, past Quentin's oversized mailbox, and let myself in through the side door using the spare key hidden under the fake rock. The house was immaculate, silent, and smelling faintly of bleach and lavender air freshener. It looked like a museum exhibit of a happy family. I moved through the rooms with the efficiency of a burglar. I wasn't there to steal. I was there to reclaim. I went into the home office and dug through the heavy metal filing cabinet until I found my original birth certificate and my old medical records. I packed them into my tote bag. I walked into the room that was technically mine, though it had slowly morphed into a storage space for Hayes' overflow of sports equipment. I took a few winter sweaters, a framed photograph of my grandmother, and my favorite hardback books. Everything else, the cheap bedding, the childhood knickknacks, the clothes Larissa had bought me on clearance to ensure I blended in, I left behind. It took me less than 20 minutes to pack up 22 years of my existence. That's how little space I occupied in that house. Before I left, I walked into the pristine kitchen. The countertops were gleaming marble. A massive stainless steel refrigerator hummed quietly in the corner, covered in photos of Hayes swinging bats, Hayes holding trophies, Hayes wearing different team uniforms. There was not a single photograph of me, not even my high school senior portrait. It was as if I had never lived there. I reached into my bag and pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was the printed transaction receipt from the bank, clearly displaying the $2,000 withdrawal made by Quentin Bishop. I placed the receipt dead center on the kitchen island, right where Larissa served her perfect Sunday breakfast. I took a black Sharpie from the junk drawer and wrote a single line across the bottom of the bank statement in neat, precise handwriting. Consider this the price of my freedom. Do not contact me. I didn't sign it. They would know who left it, or maybe they wouldn't. Maybe they would be so confused that someone dared to disrupt their perfect aesthetic that it would take them hours to figure it out. I didn't care. I placed my spare house key heavily on top of the receipt to weigh it down against the draft of the air conditioning. I walked out the side door, locked it behind me, and didn't look back. When I merged my packed Honda Civic onto the eastbound lane of Interstate 80, driving straight into the blackness of the night toward the towering, illuminated skyline of New York City, I waited for the grief to hit me. I waited for the profound sadness that movies and books tell you you're supposed to feel when you leave your family behind. But it never came. Instead, I felt an overwhelming, dizzying rush of adrenaline. I rolled the windows down, letting the warm August wind whip through my hair. I was terrified, I was broke, and I was entirely alone in the world. But for the first time in my life, I belonged exclusively to myself. I was Maëlle Callahan, and I was never going to be invisible again. The true confirmation that I had made the right decision didn't come that night. It came 4 months later, in the dead of winter, while I was shivering in a tiny, drafty apartment in Queens. I had settled into a brutal, exhausting routine in the city. I had found an entry-level administrative job at a corporate consulting firm in Manhattan, making barely enough to cover my rent and subway card. I had deleted all my old social media profiles when I changed my name, scrubbing my digital footprint completely clean. I wanted no connection to Pennsylvania. But one evening, feeling a moment of morbid curiosity, I created a blank, anonymous LinkedIn profile to see what the digital world looked like without me. I searched for a few old high school classmates just to see where they had ended up. I stumbled across the profile of a girl named Chloe who lived exactly 2 houses down from the Bishop residence. She had been Larissa's favorite neighbor to gossip with over the hedges. Chloe had recently posted an update about graduating from a nursing program. Under her post, there was a comment from Larissa Bishop. "So proud of you, Chloe. It reminds me so much of my Maëlle. We miss her terribly, but we are just thrilled about her European Business Fellowship. Living in Paris is doing wonders for her career. The Bishops are just so blessed." I stared at the glowing screen of my laptop, the ambient noise of the Queen's traffic outside my window fading away. Her European Business Fellowship, living in Paris. A harsh, bitter laugh scraped its way out of my throat. It was so perfectly, devastatingly on brand for my mother. When Quentin and Larissa had found that bank receipt on the kitchen counter, they hadn't panicked. They hadn't called the police. They hadn't hired a private investigator or driven around my college town knocking on doors or plastered my face on missing person flyers. They hadn't spent sleepless nights wondering if their daughter was safe or hungry or alive. Instead, they had looked at that note, realized I had cut them off, and immediately went into crisis public relations mode. To admit that their daughter had disowned them because they stole from her would have shattered the immaculate glass house Larissa had spent her life polishing. It would have made them look like failures to the country club elite, So, rather than face the shame of their actions, Larissa had simply invented a glamorous, highly successful alternative reality. She had fabricated a European fellowship to explain my permanent absence. They didn't search for me because finding me wasn't the goal. Protecting their reputation was. They had taken my disappearance, the most painful, definitive action of my life, and spun it into a humble brag for the neighbors. The lie was a masterstroke of emotional cowardice, and it was the greatest gift they could have ever given me. By telling the entire town that I was happily thriving in Europe, they had effectively cut off anyone who might have naturally asked questions. They had built a wall of fiction that guaranteed no one from my past would ever come looking for me in New York. They had sealed my escape route behind me, locking the door and throwing away the key. I closed the laptop, the screen going black, reflecting my own face back at me. The face of Maëlle Callahan. If they wanted me to be a successful ghost in Europe, they could have their fantasy. Meanwhile, right here in the concrete reality of Manhattan, I was going to build an empire, and I was going to build it out of the one thing the Bishop family never respected: the fine print. New York City does not care about your trauma. It does not care about your grand declarations of independence, your legally changed name, or the poetic justice of your escape. Manhattan is a gleaming, vertical meat grinder fueled by ambition and cash, and if you arrive with neither, it will gladly crush you into the pavement without breaking its stride. My first 2 years in the city were a brutal, freezing immersion into rock bottom. I lived in a 4th-floor walk-up in Queens that was technically classified as a studio, but functioned more like a walk-in closet with a hot plate. In the winter, the radiator would either hiss with skin-blistering steam or die completely, leaving me to sleep in my winter coat under 3 thin thrift store blankets. I commuted an hour and a half each way on the F train, squished against thousands of other exhausted people, smelling of damp wool, stale coffee, and the unique metallic grit of the subway tracks. But I never once considered going back. The cold in my Queens apartment was physical, easily combated with a cheap cup of deli tea. The cold in the Bishop household had been spiritual. I would take the freezing radiator over Larissa's fake smiles any day of the week. I had landed a job as an administrative assistant at Vanguard Strategic Advisors, a high-end boutique crisis management firm located in a towering glass monolith in Midtown Manhattan. Vanguard wasn't a standard PR agency that wrote cheerful press releases for new lipsticks. They were the fixers. When a Fortune 500 CEO was caught embezzling, when a pharmaceutical company's new drug caused undisclosed side effects, or when a tech giant suffered a catastrophic data breach, Vanguard was the firm they called in the middle of the night to stop the bleeding. It was a world of high-stakes paranoia, non-disclosure agreements, and exorbitant billing hours. And at the absolute bottom of this opulent food chain was me. My direct supervisor was a man named Bradley Sterling. Bradley was a junior partner at Vanguard, a title he had achieved not through raw intellect or grueling hard work, but through the flawless execution of being born to the right father. He was 32, tall, conventionally handsome, in a generic catalog model sort of way, and possessed the kind of unearned, bulletproof confidence that only comes from a lifetime of generational wealth. He wore custom-tailored Tom Ford suits, mentioned his Ivy League alma mater within the first 5 minutes of meeting anyone, and treated the support staff like slightly inconvenient pieces of voice-activated furniture. "Callahan!" he would bark, snapping his manicured fingers without looking up from his phone as he walked past my desk. "I need the risk assessment files for the tech merger on my desk in 10, and get me a macchiato from that place on 5th, not the sludge in the break room." He never called me Maëlle. To him, I was just a surname, a function, a pair of hands meant to smooth the wrinkles out of his effortless daily existence. At first, working for Bradley was infuriating. He was lazy, he took 3-hour lunches with his fraternity brothers, and he routinely took credit for the meticulous research reports compiled by the exhausted junior analysts. But as the months bled into my second year at Vanguard, my frustration morphed into a sharp, clinical fascination. I stopped seeing Bradley as a boss and started studying him as a specimen. You see, growing up in the Quentin and Larissa Bishop household hadn't just given me an ironclad work ethic and a tolerance for emotional neglect. It had unwittingly provided me with the most rigorous, advanced training in human psychology imaginable. When you are an invisible child living in a house built on financial lies and social anxiety, your physical and emotional survival depends entirely on your ability to read the weather of the room. You become an apex predator of microexpressions. By the time I was 12, I knew that if Quentin's jaw muscle twitched twice while he was looking at a piece of mail, a contractor had sued him and I needed to disappear into my room for the rest of the evening. I knew that if Larissa's voice went up half an octave while speaking to a neighbor, she was lying about something expensive. I knew the exact difference between the heavy, dragging footsteps of my father's genuine despair and the sharp, staccato pacing of his manufactured anger. I learned to read the silence. I learned to hear what people were desperately trying not to say. In the corporate boardrooms of Vanguard, this trauma-born defense mechanism became my superpower. Bradley Sterling, for all his expensive education, was entirely blind to human nature. He believed that business was conducted purely through aggressive handshakes, golf course banter, and shouting the loudest in a meeting. He looked at people and only saw what they explicitly presented to him. I sat in the corner of his meetings taking notes, invisible and entirely ignored, and I saw everything. I saw the way the CEO of a failing logistics company gripped his expensive Montblanc pen so tightly his knuckles turned white, revealing that he was absolutely terrified of bankruptcy, despite his arrogant posturing. I saw the way a tech founder's eyes darted to the door every time Bradley mentioned a specific offshore account, a dead giveaway that there were undocumented funds Vanguard hadn't been told about. Bradley would walk out of these meetings, clapping his hands together, boasting, "We've got them right where we want them, Callahan." They loved my pitch. I would walk behind him, my legal pad filled not just with his dictated notes, but with behavioral profiles. The CEO is lying about the Q3 revenue. The founder is preparing to throw his CFO under the bus to save himself. I didn't share these insights with Bradley. Why would I? I was just the assistant fetching his macchiatos. Instead, I used my invisibility to build an arsenal. When Bradley tossed massive, dense legal contracts onto my desk at 5:30 p.m. on a Friday and told me to file them away, I didn't just shove them into a cabinet. I stayed until midnight. I read them. I applied the same terrifying, meticulous scrutiny to Fortune 500 contracts that I had applied to my own federal student loan agreements years ago. I read the fine print. I studied the indemnification clauses, the liability limits, the hidden arbitration agreements. I taught myself the anatomy of a corporate disaster. I realized very quickly that most massive crises didn't start with a giant explosion. They started with a single, ambiguous sentence buried on page 42 of a vendor agreement that a lazy junior partner like Bradley Sterling couldn't be bothered to read. I was getting a world-class education in high-level crisis management, and Vanguard was paying me an administrative assistant's salary to do it. While Bradley was my daily obstacle, there was another figure at Vanguard who became my ultimate obsession: Eleanor Reed. Eleanor was one of the 3 senior partners at the firm. She was a woman in her late 50s with sharp, aristocratic features, silver hair cut into a severe, immaculate bob, and eyes the color of a winter sky. She did not yell. She did not boast. She rarely even raised her voice. But when Eleanor Reed walked into a room, the temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees, and the most powerful men in Manhattan sat up a little straighter. She was the firm's apex predator. She handled the catastrophic, existential threats, the clients facing federal indictments or massive congressional hearings. I watched Eleanor the way a student watches a grandmaster. I noticed that she never answered a question immediately. She always allowed a 3-second silence to stretch out, forcing the other person to fill the uncomfortable void, often revealing more than they intended. I noticed that she dressed in neutral, impenetrable colors, navies, charcoals, blacks, acting as a mirror so her clients could project whatever savior they needed onto her. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, I was tasked with delivering a stack of printed briefs to Eleanor's corner office. It was a rare occurrence. Usually, her own executive assistant handled her floor. I knocked softly on the heavy glass door. "Enter," a cool voice called out. I walked in. The office was vast, smelling of expensive leather and rain against the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Park Avenue. Eleanor was standing by the window, reviewing a document. She didn't look up. "The Sterling briefs, Ms. Reed," I said, my voice steady, placing the immaculate stack on the corner of her mahogany desk. "Did Bradley actually read these, or did he just sign the cover page and have you print them?" she asked. The question was casual, but it felt like a trap. I paused. The instinct I had learned from Larissa Bishop was to cover for the incompetence of my superiors. Keep the peace. Maintain the image. But I was Mael Callahan now. I didn't owe Bradley Sterling a damn thing. Mr. Sterling reviewed the executive summary. I replied carefully, keeping my tone perfectly neutral. However, I took the liberty of highlighting the liability exposure in Section 4, Clause B. The client's current phrasing leaves them open to a class action lawsuit if the environmental report is leaked prior to the Q4 earnings call. I tabbed the page for your convenience. For the first time, Eleanor Reed lowered the document in her hands and actually looked at me. Her gray eyes locked onto mine. It was like being scanned by an X-ray machine. She didn't look at my cheap blazer or my scuffed Sensible heels. She looked directly into my brain. She walked over to the desk, flipped the stack of briefs to the exact page I had tabbed, and read the highlighted section in silence. The heavy ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner of her office seemed to echo in my chest. "You caught this?" she asked, her voice dangerously quiet. A junior partner signed off on this, and an administrative assistant caught a multi-million-dollar liability loophole. "I am very thorough when I file, Ms. Reed," I said, maintaining absolute eye contact. I didn't smile. I didn't seek her approval. I just stated a fact. Eleanor studied me for another long, agonizing moment. Then, the faintest ghost of a smirk touched the corner of her mouth. "What is your name?" she asked. "Mael Callahan." "Well, Ms. Callahan, it seems you are entirely overqualified for whatever Bradley Sterling is paying you to do. Leave the files. Close the door behind you." I walked out of her office with my spine straight, my heart hammering a triumphant rhythm against my ribs. I had planted the seed. I hadn't begged for a promotion. I hadn't complained about my boss. I had simply demonstrated undeniable, lethal competence. That brief interaction fundamentally shifted my strategy. I was no longer just surviving New York. I was preparing for war. Over the next 6 months, I began to actively shadow manage Bradley Sterling's entire portfolio. I didn't do it to help him. I did it to build a flawless, undeniable ledger of his incompetence and my own value. When Bradley prepared to advise a major retail chain to aggressively deny allegations of unfair labor practices, I secretly compiled a secondary portfolio. I used my late nights to dig through the client's public filings, cross-referencing them with anonymous employee complaints on message boards. I read the linguistic patterns of the complaints. They weren't coordinated attacks. They were the desperate, specific cries of exhausted workers. I knew what desperation sounded like. I knew that if the retail chain aggressively denied the claims, the workers would leak internal memos out of sheer spite, turning a manageable PR issue into a national scandal. Bradley was steering his client directly into an iceberg because he couldn't read the emotional temperature of the working class. He had never been working class. I quietly drafted an alternative crisis strategy. One focused on immediate, localized accountability, independent audits, and empathetic restructuring. I didn't give this strategy to Bradley. I saved it on a secure, encrypted flash drive that I kept in my purse. My flash drive became my insurance policy. It was filled with corrected contracts, alternative strategies, and meticulous documentation of every catastrophic error Bradley Sterling almost made, which I had quietly intercepted and fixed under the guise of administrative formatting. I was acting as a junior partner, doing the intellectual heavy lifting, while Bradley spent his afternoons at the Yale Club, collecting a 6-figure salary and the firm's prestige. The exhaustion of my double life was intense. I was still living on cheap takeout, still freezing in my Queens apartment, still wearing the same 3 heavily rotated professional outfits. My bank account was growing, but slowly. Yet, I felt a strange, vibrating energy humming beneath my skin. Every time Bradley snapped his fingers at me, every time he called me assistant instead of my name, every time he casually dismissed my intelligence because of my job title, he was digging his own grave. He thought I was a ghost, a piece of background scenery entirely subjected to his will. He didn't realize that ghosts see everything. They walk through your locked doors, they read your hidden documents, and they wait patiently in the dark. I thought about Quentin and Larissa occasionally during those long, grueling nights in the Vanguard archives. I thought about the lie they had told their neighbors, the fictional European fellowship they had invented to cover up their own moral bankruptcy. They thought they had disposed of me cleanly. They thought I was a casualty of their ambition, a weak link they had successfully cut loose. I would look at my reflection in the dark glass of the Manhattan skyscraper windows, the city lights glittering below me like scattered diamonds. You taught me how to read the monsters in the room, I thought, projecting the words out across the miles to a pristine, silent house in Pennsylvania. You taught me how to survive in a house built on lies. You thought you were breaking me, but you were just sharpening the blade. I wasn't in Paris. I wasn't on a glamorous fellowship. I was in the belly of the beast, learning the exact pressure points of the men who run the world. My name was Mael Callahan, and I was almost ready to strike. Winter in New York City during my 4th year was a brutal, unforgiving season. The kind of winter where the wind whipping off the Hudson River felt like shattered glass against your face, and the dirty snow piled at the intersections turned into treacherous, gray slush. I was 26 years old. I had spent 4 years fetching coffee, formatting documents, and quietly inhaling the toxic, high-stakes atmosphere of Vanguard strategic advisors. I was exhausted down to my marrow, but it was a sharp, focused kind of exhaustion. The kind a predator feels right before the ambush. The crisis that would forever alter the trajectory of my life arrived on a Tuesday in early February, disguised as a routine client emergency. Our client was Veritas Medical Solutions, a multi-billion-dollar medical device conglomerate. They had just launched a revolutionary new surgical mesh used in spinal reconstructions. The stock was soaring. The CEO, a notoriously volatile man named Richard Vance, was preparing for a victory lap on CNBC. There was only one problem: a whistleblower. A senior bioengineer who had worked on the mesh's development had leaked an internal memo to a prominent investigative journalist at the Wall Street Journal. The memo alleged that the mesh had a 12% failure rate over a 3-year period, causing severe, sometimes fatal, internal infections. It was the kind of scandal that didn't just tank a stock. It sent executives to federal prison. Bradley Sterling, in all his arrogant Ivy League glory, had been assigned as the lead crisis manager for the Veritas account. I watched the disaster unfold from my small desk outside his sprawling corner office. Bradley's strategy was aggressive, archaic, and entirely rooted in his own ego. He viewed the whistleblower not as a liability, but as an insubordinate peasant who needed to be crushed. "We bury them, Richard," I heard Bradley shouting through the crack in his office door while on speakerphone with the CEO. The engineer signed a watertight, ironclad non-disclosure agreement. We hit them with a massive cease and desist. We threatened to sue them for corporate espionage into absolute bankruptcy. We deny the failure rate, discredit the engineer as a disgruntled ex-employee, and threaten the journal with a defamation suit if they run the piece. We do not negotiate. Sitting at my desk, my fingers hovered over my keyboard. I felt the familiar, icy prickle of adrenaline at the back of my neck. Bradley hadn't read the fine print. He had read the executive summary provided by Veritas's aggressive corporate lawyers. He had looked at the standard NDA and assumed it was an impenetrable fortress. But the night before, while Bradley was at a Knicks game, I had stayed at the office until 1 a.m., painstakingly cross-referencing the engineer's employment history with the federal contracts Veritas held. I had found the fatal flaw. The engineer's specific department at Veritas received partial funding from a Department of Defense grant for trauma research. Because of that single, obscure financial tie, the engineer was legally classified as a federal contractor. Under the False Claims Act and federal whistleblower protection laws, corporate NDAs are instantly rendered null and void if the employee is reporting a danger to public safety involving federal funds. If Bradley advised Richard Vance to aggressively sue this engineer, it wouldn't silence the story. It would act as a massive, blazing flare gun to the Department of Justice. The moment Veritas filed that lawsuit, it would trigger an automatic federal investigation for retaliation, completely bypassing the FDA and turning a manageable corporate crisis into a criminal federal indictment. Bradley was walking a multi-billion-dollar company directly into a live minefield because he was too lazy to read a 70-page employment addendum. By Thursday afternoon, the impending reality began to close in. The Wall Street Journal reporter had responded to Bradley's threatening cease and desist letter. The reporter didn't back down. Instead, they politely cited the exact federal whistleblower statute I had found, thanked Bradley for his official statement of denial, and informed him the expose would run on the front page Monday morning. The panic that emanated from Bradley's office was visceral. It smelled like expensive cologne and sour sweat. He called me into his office at 4:30 p.m. His normally perfect hair was disheveled. He was pacing frantically behind his desk, his breathing shallow. "Callahan," he barked, his voice higher than usual. "Close the door." I closed it, standing quietly with my hands folded in front of me. I kept my face entirely blank, a perfect, unreadable canvas. I was channeling Larissa Bishop's absolute emotional detachment, but I was weaponizing it for my own survival. "There's been a complication with the Veritas account," Bradley stammered, running a hand over his face. "A federal statute complication. The legal team missed it. We missed it." He stopped pacing and looked at me. The desperation in his eyes was pathetic. He wasn't looking at an assistant, he was looking for a scapegoat. "I need you to draft a memo, backdated to last Friday. Bradley said, his words spilling out in a rushed, hushed tone. The memo needs to state that you were tasked with filing the Department of Defense funding addendums, and that due to an administrative oversight on your end, they were not included in the primary risk assessment packet given to me. I'll make sure you aren't fired, Callahan. I'll tell the partners it was a simple clerical error, a minor reprimand, but I need your signature on it to protect the firm's liability. He was trying to destroy my life to save his country club membership. He was asking me to legally document my own incompetence, to take the bullet for a multi-million-dollar malpractice error so he could maintain his pristine reputation. For a fraction of a second, I thought about Quentin taking the $2,000 from my account. I thought about how the men in my life had always assumed I would simply absorb their failures, clean up their messes, and quietly fade into the background. They all thought I was disposable. I looked at Bradley Sterling, and I felt absolutely nothing but a cold surgical precision. I understand, Mr. Sterling, I said softly. I will go prepare the necessary documentation. Good girl, he sighed, collapsing into his leather chair, looking at the ceiling. Make it quick. I walked out of his office, went straight to my desk, and opened my purse. I bypassed the blank legal pads and reached into the zippered pocket, pulling out the small, black, encrypted flash drive I had been meticulously updating for 3 years. The ledger of Bradley's sins. I didn't draft his suicidal memo. Instead, I spent the entire night compiling a 50-page crisis mitigation binder. It was the real strategy. It outlined a voluntary product recall, a strategic pivot of the company's public narrative to patient safety above profits, a proactive settlement with the victims, and a plan to cooperate fully with the DOJ to get ahead of the journal piece. It was brilliant, it was legally bulletproof, and it was entirely mine. Friday morning arrived like an execution. Richard Vance, the CEO of Veritas, stormed through the glass doors of Vanguard Strategic Advisors at 8 a.m., flanked by 2 pale corporate lawyers. His face was a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He didn't even stop at the reception desk. He marched directly toward the main executive boardroom. A moment later, Eleanor Reed emerged from her office. She wore a charcoal gray suit, her silver hair perfect, her expression as icy and unreadable as a frozen lake. She walked into the boardroom. Bradley practically sprinted after her, clutching a meaningless stack of papers, his face the color of wet ash. The heavy glass doors of the boardroom slid shut. The blinds were drawn. The entire floor of the agency held its collective breath. Through the thick glass, even with the soundproofing, we could hear the muffled, booming baritone of Richard Vance shouting. He was screaming about billions in lost market cap. He was screaming about prison. I sat at my desk for exactly 10 minutes. I checked my watch. I smoothed the wrinkles out of my sensible, cheap skirt. I picked up the thick, heavy binder containing my strategy, the flash drive securely tucked in my pocket. Then I stood up and walked toward the boardroom. The executive assistant to the partners tried to wave me away frantically. Maëlle, no, you can't go in there. It's a bloodbath. I know, I said, and I pushed the heavy glass door open. The shouting stopped instantly. The silence in the room was so heavy it felt pressurized. Richard Vance turned his furious, red face toward me. His lawyers looked confused. Bradley looked like he was about to have a coronary. Callahan, get the hell out of here, Bradley hissed, his voice cracking with panic. We are in the middle of a privileged meeting. Eleanor Reed sat at the head of the long mahogany table. She didn't speak. She just steepled her fingers and watched me with those piercing winter sky eyes. I didn't look at Bradley. I walked straight up to Richard Vance, the billionaire CEO who was currently threatening to sue our firm into oblivion. I placed the thick binder directly in front of him. Mr. Vance, I said, my voice steady, projecting across the massive room. My name is Maëlle Callahan. The strategy you were previously advised to execute was based on a fundamental failure to review your Department of Defense funding ties. If you send that cease and desist to the Wall Street Journal today, you will face federal indictment by Tuesday. Vance stared at me, his jaw tight. Who the hell are you? I am the person who is going to keep you out of federal prison, I replied smoothly. I tapped the binder. The whistleblower is federally protected under the False Claims Act. You cannot crush them. You have to absorb them. Inside this binder is a comprehensive step-by-step mitigation strategy. You will initiate a voluntary Class 1 recall of the surgical mesh by 2 p.m. today. You will draft an open letter to your shareholders apologizing for the oversight, framing this as a proactive measure triggered by your own internal safety audits. You beat the journal to the punch. You control the narrative. The stock will take a 20% hit on Monday, but it will stabilize by Thursday because Wall Street respects radical transparency. If you fight the government, you lose everything. If you pivot to patient advocacy, you save your company. Vance slowly looked down at the binder. He opened the cover. He read the first page, his eyes scanning the dense, meticulously cited legal precedents and PR drafting I had prepared. Bradley was hyperventilating. "Richard, listen to me. She's just an assistant. She doesn't know what she's talking about." "Shut up, Bradley," Vance snapped, not taking his eyes off my document. He read the second page, then the third. The deep crimson color slowly began to drain from his face, replaced by the grim, focused pallor of a man who realizes he was just pulled back from the edge of a cliff. Vance looked up at his lawyers. "Is she right about the federal contractor statute?" One of the lawyers, sweating profusely, pulled out a tablet, typed furiously for a few seconds, and then swallowed hard. "Yes, sir. It appears the funding grant does trigger federal protection. She's absolutely right." Vance closed the binder. He didn't look at Bradley. He looked at Eleanor. "Eleanor," Vance said, his voice deadly calm, "I am paying your firm a retainer of $400,000 a month, and the only person in this building who isn't a complete idiot is standing right here in a cheap blazer." He pointed a thick finger at Bradley. "If I ever see his face on my account again, I am pulling my business and suing Vanguard for malpractice. I want her running point on this recall strategy immediately." Without waiting for a response, Vance picked up the binder and marched out of the room, his lawyers trailing behind him like frightened dogs. The heavy glass doors slid shut. The room was utterly silent. Bradley was gripping the edge of the conference table, his knuckles white, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. He turned to Eleanor, desperation leaking from his pores. "Eleanor, I can explain. She undermined me. She purposely withheld that information to stage a coup." "Bradley," Eleanor said. Her voice was barely a whisper, but it cut through the air like a scalpel. "Leave us." "But Eleanor," I said, "leave us." Bradley looked at me. It was a look of pure, venomous hatred, but underneath it, I saw the absolute terror of a mediocre man whose armor had finally been stripped away. He grabbed his files and hurried out of the room, looking small and broken. I was alone with Eleanor Reed. She remained seated at the head of the table. I stood at the opposite end. The silence stretched out for 10, 20, 30 seconds. I didn't break it. I didn't fidget. I held my ground, meeting her gaze with the unblinking intensity of a survivor. "That," Eleanor finally said, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across her aristocratic face, "was the most ruthless corporate assassination I have seen in 20 years. "It wasn't an assassination, Ms. Reed," I replied quietly. "It was an intervention. Bradley was a liability to this firm. I simply excised the tumor before it killed the patient." Eleanor leaned forward, resting her arms on the mahogany table. "You saved a $50 million account today, Ms. Callahan. You embarrassed a junior partner, but you saved the firm's reputation. Most assistants in your position would ask for a very generous bonus. Some might ask for a letter of recommendation to law school. What is it that you want?" I walked slowly around the massive table until I was standing right next to her. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the encrypted flash drive. I placed it gently on the polished wood between us. "I don't want a bonus, Eleanor," I said, dropping the formal Ms. Reed. "On that drive is a meticulously documented history of every catastrophic error Bradley Sterling has made over the last 3 years. Errors I intercepted, corrected, and filed away. It is proof of his gross negligence and proof of my strategic management of his entire portfolio. If that drive were to accidentally find its way to the Vanguard board of directors, Bradley wouldn't just be fired. The firm would face an internal audit that would cost you millions." Eleanor looked at the small black drive. She didn't look angry. She looked deeply, profoundly intrigued. "Are you blackmailing a senior partner, Mael?" "I am negotiating from a position of undeniable leverage," I corrected smoothly. "I want Bradley Sterling's employment terminated by the end of the day. I want his corner office. I want his title as junior partner, and I want an equity track written into my contract by Monday morning." Eleanor let out a soft, genuine laugh. It was a sound rarely heard in that building. "You have no law degree. You have no MBA. You are 26 years old." "And yet," I said, leaning down slightly so we were eye to eye, "I am the only reason Vanguard isn't on the front page of the Wall Street Journal as an accessory to corporate fraud. I am not asking for a seat at the table, Eleanor. I am showing you that I already own the chair. You can either fight me or you can weaponize me." Eleanor Reed stared into my eyes. She saw the years of starvation in Queens. She saw the trauma of a stolen future. She saw a woman who had absolutely nothing to lose, which made me the most dangerous person in the room. She reached out, her perfectly manicured fingers closing over the black flash drive, and slipped it into her pocket. "Have your belongings moved into Bradley's office by 3 o'clock, Eleanor said, her voice thrumming with dark approval. "Welcome to the partnership, Maëlle." The metamorphosis of Maëlle Callahan did not happen overnight, but once the dam broke, the flood was unstoppable. The time jump from that Friday in the boardroom to my 31st birthday was a blur of relentless, unapologetic ascension. I didn't just walk through the door Eleanor had opened, I tore the door off its hinges. Within 5 years, Vanguard Strategic Advisors underwent a massive internal shift. I became the youngest senior partner in the history of the firm. I had negotiated a 30% equity stake in the agency. The girl who had once cried over $14.50 in a sweltering Honda Civic now commanded a net worth of over $4 million. My life transformed into an insulated fortress of luxury and control. I moved out of the freezing walk-up in Queens and purchased a sprawling, glass-walled penthouse in Tribeca. The view from my balcony wasn't of dirty alleyways. It was a sweeping, unbroken panorama of the Manhattan skyline, a glittering kingdom that I had conquered with my own bare hands. My cheap, thrifted blazers were replaced by a wardrobe of bespoke Tom Ford and Armani suits, sharp, structural armor in shades of charcoal, midnight blue, and stark white. I wore stilettos that sounded like gunshots on the marble floors of corporate headquarters. When I walked into a room, CEOs twice my age stopped talking. They didn't see an assistant. They didn't see an invisible daughter. They saw the shark of Vanguard. They saw the woman who could make federal investigations disappear, who could restructure failing conglomerates, and who never, ever lost. I was respected. I was feared. I was wealthy beyond anything Quentin and Larissa Bishop could ever comprehend. But true success is a strange, isolating thing. As my bank accounts swelled and my reputation became legendary in the financial district, I realized that the armor I had built was so thick nothing could hurt me anymore. But nothing could really touch me either. I rarely thought about Pennsylvania. I had effectively buried the Bishop family in a shallow grave in my mind. They were a past life, a cautionary tale about trusting the wrong people. I assumed they were still living in their glass house, still pretending I was in Paris, still worshiping at the altar of Hayes' baseball career. I was untouchable. I believed that I had completely outrun my ghosts. But New York City has a funny way of stripping away your illusions just when you feel the most secure. You can change your name, you can amass millions, and you can build a fortress in the sky, but the past is a relentless bloodhound. It doesn't care about your penthouse. It only waits for you to make enough noise to be found. And I had just made the front page of the Wall Street Journal. The Wall Street Journal feature ran on a crisp Thursday morning in late October. The headline spanned the top fold of the business and finance section in bold, uncompromising ink. The architect of the aftermath. How Maëlle Callahan and Vanguard Strategic Advisors are rewriting corporate crisis management. There was a full-page photograph of me standing in the Vanguard boardroom. I was wearing a stark white Tom Ford suit, my arms crossed, my expression a study in impenetrable calm. I looked like a woman who could dismantle a Fortune 500 company before finishing her morning espresso. The article detailed my rapid ascent to senior partner, my restructuring of the Veritas medical recall, and my philosophical approach to crisis mitigation. Most firms try to shout over the fire, I was quoted as saying. I prefer to quietly remove the oxygen. It was the crowning achievement of a 9-year metamorphosis. It was professional validation at the highest possible level of American capitalism. I had my executive assistant, a razor-sharp woman named Elena who made 6 figures just to manage my calendar, frame a copy of the article for my office wall. I looked at it for exactly 2 minutes, allowed myself a brief, private smile of satisfaction, and then went back to work. By 10 a.m., I was deep into a conference call with a tech CEO in Silicon Valley. I didn't think about the fact that the Wall Street Journal is distributed nationwide. I didn't think about the fact that Quentin Bishop, a man desperate to project an image of financial literacy, kept a subscription to it on the coffee table of his country club lounge. At 2:15 p.m., Elena knocked sharply on my frosted glass door and stepped inside without waiting for an answer. Her face, usually a mask of flawless corporate composure, carried a tight, urgent expression. I muted the conference call. "What is it, Elena?" Mael, building security just called up from the main lobby, she said, her voice dropping an octave. There are 3 people down there demanding to see you. They do not have an appointment. Security was about to escort them off the premises, but they are causing a scene, claiming it is a family emergency. The temperature in my office seemed to plummet. The hairs on the back of my arms stood up. Did they give names? Quentin, Larissa, and Hayes Bishop. And I? Elena looked at me carefully. She knew my legal name was Callahan. She knew nothing of my past, only that I had emerged fully formed from the crucible of New York. They say they are your parents and your brother. For 5 seconds, the absolute silence of my Tribeca penthouse, the freezing Queens walk-up, the suffocating heat of the graduation parking lot, and the stolen $2,000 all slammed into my chest at once. It was a phantom pain, an old wound flaring up in the rain. But I was no longer a 22-year-old girl waiting for permission to exist. I was 31 years old. I was a senior partner at Vanguard. I exhaled slowly, the icy calm washing over the momentary panic. I unmuted the phone. Gentlemen, I have to step into an urgent partners briefing. My associate will walk you through the final restructuring clauses. We reconvene at 4. I disconnected the call and stood up, smoothing the front of my charcoal blazer. Elena, I said, my voice perfectly level. Tell security to give them guest passes and escort them to conference room A. Do not offer them coffee. Do not offer them water. Then I need you to pull a comprehensive, expedited financial background check on Bishop Construction in Pennsylvania. Use the Dun & Bradstreet Premium Access. I want their credit rating, any active liens, and a history of their defaulted loans over the last 5 years. I need it printed and on my desk in 10 minutes. Elena didn't blink. Consider it done. I spent the next 10 minutes standing by my floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the jagged steel skyline of Manhattan. I had spent 9 years assuming they would never look for me, thanks to Larissa's fabricated European fellowship. But ego is a powerful thing. Seeing my face in the Wall Street Journal, seeing the undeniable, staggering success of the daughter they had discarded, must have been a psychological short circuit they couldn't ignore. Elena walked in and handed me a thin manila folder. The financial report on Bishop Construction, she said softly. I opened it. I scanned the first page. A slow, dark realization crept over me, followed by a profound, almost tragic sense of vindication. They hadn't come because they missed me. The truth printed in cold, hard financial data was infinitely more pathetic. I closed the folder, picked it up, and walked down the long, silent hallway of the Vanguard executive floor. Conference Room A was designed specifically to intimidate. It was a massive, cavernous space featuring a 20-foot slab of black marble for a table, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling glass that offered a dizzying, terrifying view of the city from 60 stories up. I opened the heavy glass doors. They were standing near the window, huddled close together, looking entirely out of place against the backdrop of ruthless corporate wealth. Quentin looked older, his shoulders slightly hunched, his cheap suit visibly pulling at the seams. Larissa's blonde hair was still perfectly styled, but the lines around her mouth were deeply entrenched, her designer knockoff handbag clutched tightly to her chest. Hayes. Hayes looked exhausted. The golden child, now 28, didn't look like an elite athlete. He looked like a man crushed by the weight of a life he never actually wanted. They turned as the door clicked shut behind me. Mael! Larissa gasped. Her eyes widened, taking in the immaculate cut of my suit, the posture, the absolute authority radiating from my silence. For a second, I saw genuine shock. I wasn't the mousy, invisible girl who kept her head down anymore. She took a step forward, her arms opening for a theatrical hug. Oh, my sweet girl, we have been looking everywhere for you. When we saw the newspaper, stop right there, I said. My voice wasn't raised. It was quiet, conversational, and completely devoid of warmth. It stopped her dead in her tracks as effectively as a physical blow. I walked to the head of the black marble table and placed the manila folder down. I didn't sit. Ms. Callahan is fine, I said, looking directly into my mother's eyes. Or Mael, if you prefer. But do not touch me, and do not insult my intelligence by claiming you have been looking for me. Quentin bristled, his patriarchal instincts flaring up in a pathetic attempt to assert dominance in a room he absolutely did not own. Now, listen here, Mael. Is that any way to speak to your mother? We drove 4 hours the minute we saw the journal article. We thought you were in Europe for years. Europe, I repeated, tasting the bitter irony of the word. You thought I was in Europe because Larissa lied to the entire neighborhood to cover up the fact that I abandoned this family. I didn't leave a forwarding address, Quentin. I left a bank receipt showing you stole my graduation money. My only escape fund. Hayes flinched visibly, looking down at the carpet. Larissa's face flushed a deep, ugly red. It was a misunderstanding, Larissa practically shrieked, her carefully constructed country club facade cracking. Your father needed that money to secure Hayes' future. You were always so independent, Maëlle. We knew you would figure it out. We are a family. Families share burdens. You didn't share a burden, Larissa. You robbed a 22-year-old girl who was working 3 jobs, I said smoothly. But we aren't here to litigate the past. Time is money, and my billing rate is currently $2,000 an hour. So, why don't you tell me exactly why you bypassed security to ambush me in my place of business? Quentin cleared his throat, adjusting his tie. He puffed out his chest, stepping into the role of the benevolent businessman. He looked around the opulent boardroom, taking in the mahogany and the marble. Well, Quentin began, attempting a magnanimous smile that looked more like a grimace. We saw the article. We saw that you've built a nice little consulting firm here. But I know how hard it is to scale a business, Maëlle. I know the cash flow problems that come with expansion. He paused, waiting for me to nod in grateful agreement. I simply stared at him, my face a mask of stone. The construction business has been very good to us lately, Quentin lied smoothly, a practice pitch he had likely used on a dozen small-town bank managers. We want to make things right. We want to bring this family back together, and to prove it, I'm prepared to write you a check today. I want to invest $300,000 into Vanguard. We can be partners, Maëlle. Family business, just like it always should have been. He stood there, waiting for the applause, waiting for the prodigal daughter to fall to her knees, weeping with gratitude that her father had finally deemed her worthy of his financial backing. He thought he was offering me the ultimate prize, his validation, backed by his checkbook. The silence in the room stretched out until it became suffocating. I looked at Quentin. I looked at Larissa, who was nodding eagerly, a desperate, hungry glint in her eyes. I looked at Hayes, who looked like he wanted the floor to open up and swallow him whole. Then, I laughed. It wasn't a joyful sound. It was a dry, razor-sharp exhalation of pure disbelief. $300,000, I repeated slowly. You want to invest $300,000 into Vanguard Strategic Advisors. That's right, Quentin said, his smile faltering slightly at my reaction, a show of good faith. I reached over and pressed a button on the control panel built into the marble table. The privacy blinds over the glass walls silently hummed open, revealing the sprawling, hyperactive trading floor of my agency below, filled with hundreds of analysts, lawyers, and financial experts working on multi-billion-dollar accounts. Quentin, I said softly, leaning forward and resting my knuckles on the marble, the monthly retainer for a single client at this firm is $400,000. We represent sovereign wealth funds. We manage the crisis portfolios of Fortune 50 pharmaceutical companies. The art hanging in the lobby downstairs is insured for more than your entire construction company has grossed in the last decade. The color rapidly drained from Quentin's face. The arrogant posture collapsed, leaving a hollow, aging man in a cheap suit. I am a senior partner, I continued, my voice echoing slightly in the massive room. I own 30% of this agency. My personal net worth crossed the $5 million mark 2 years ago. Your $300,000 wouldn't cover the annual catering budget for this floor. Larissa let out a small, strangled gasp, her hand flying to her mouth. She looked around the room, the terrifying scale of my reality finally crashing through her delusions. The daughter she had ignored wasn't just doing well, she was a titan. But that's not the really funny part, I said, my voice dropping to a lethal whisper. The really funny part is that you don't even have $300,000, do you, Quentin? Quentin froze. His eyes darted to the door, then back to me. I don't know what you mean. Business is booming. I picked up the manila folder and slid it across the length of the black marble table. It stopped inches from Quentin's hands. That is a premium Dun & Bradstreet financial profile on Bishop Construction, pulled 10 minutes ago, I stated. You have 3 active mechanics liens against your primary equipment. You defaulted on your commercial real estate loan 90 days ago. Your credit rating is classified as severe risk. You are approximately 6 weeks away from total bankruptcy and foreclosure on the family home." The room was so quiet I could hear the rapid, shallow breathing of my mother. "You didn't come to New York to make amends, Quentin," I said, performing a surgical dissection of his soul. "You didn't come here to offer me a show of good faith. You came here because you saw the Wall Street Journal. You saw the words senior partner and millions. You realize the invisible daughter you drove away is now a liquid asset with an immaculate credit score. You came here to manipulate me into co-signing a lifeline loan to save your drowning company." Quentin stared at the folder as if it were a venomous snake. He didn't open it. He didn't need to. He knew I had caught him. "Mael, please," Larissa choked out, her voice cracking, the fake country club veneer shattering into a million pieces. Tears, thick and desperate, spilled over her mascara. "We're going to lose the house. We're going to lose everything. You have so much. You could save us with a stroke of a pen. We're your family." "You are genetics," I corrected her, feeling absolutely no pity. "You are an accident of biology. A family does not steal a child's graduation money. A family does not lie to their neighbors to protect their pride rather than search for their missing daughter. A family does not show up after 9 years of silence pretending to offer an olive branch when they are actually hiding a loaded gun." "It was all for Hayes," Quentin shouted suddenly, his fear turning into cornered, desperate anger. He pointed a trembling finger at my brother. "Everything we did was for him. He blew out his shoulder his sophomore year of college. He lost the scholarship. He ruined the plan. We bet everything on him, and he failed us." I looked at Hayes, my brother, the golden child, the boy who had consumed all the oxygen in our house. He was staring at our father with a look of such profound, exhausted devastation that it momentarily stopped my breath. Quentin wasn't just throwing me under the bus. He was throwing his prized possession right beside me to save his own skin. "No, Quentin," I said, my voice cutting through his pathetic shouting. "You failed yourselves. You built a house of cards and you expected your children to be the concrete holding it up." I stepped away from the table and walked toward the door. I opened it and stood in the threshold. "This meeting is over," I announced. "You are going to take the elevator down to the lobby. You are going to walk out onto Park Avenue and you are going to go back to Pennsylvania. You will not call me. You will not return to this building. If you attempt to contact me or my firm again, I will have Vanguard's legal department file a harassment injunction so fast it will make your head spin." Quentin looked at me, his eyes wide with a terrifying realization. The realization that he had absolutely zero power in this room. He was a beggar demanding a feast from a queen he had once starved. Larissa was openly sobbing now, reaching her hands out toward me. "Mael, please, you can't let us go bankrupt. What will the neighbors think? What will everyone say?" Even now, standing on the precipice of ruin, her only concern was the audience. "They'll say the bishops finally ran out of credit," I replied coldly. "Security will escort you out." Quentin and Larissa shuffled toward the door, broken, humiliated, stripped of every illusion they had ever clung to. As they passed me, I didn't look at them. I looked through them. They had finally achieved the exact status they had given me for 22 years. They were entirely invisible to me. Hayes was the last to leave the room. He stopped in the doorway. He was taller than me, but he looked small. He looked down at me, his eyes red-rimmed and utterly exhausted. I braced myself for his anger. I expected him to blame me, to lash out like Quentin. Instead, Hayes simply nodded. It was a slow, agonizing movement. "You were the smart one, Mael," Hayes whispered, his voice hoarse. "You got out. Don't ever look back." He walked past me, following our parents down the long, immaculate hallway toward the elevators. I stood in the doorway of Conference Room A, the heavy silence of the floor wrapping around me. My heart was beating a steady, rhythmic drum in my chest. I had anticipated rage. I had anticipated a triumphant, explosive joy at finally getting my revenge. But as the elevator doors chimed and slid shut, swallowing the Bishop family forever, I didn't feel rage. I felt a profound, sweeping emptiness. The ghost that had haunted me for 9 years was finally, permanently dead. The heavy wool coat of my past had slipped off my shoulders and fallen to the floor. I took a deep breath of the filtered, climate-controlled air of my empire. I turned around, walked back to my penthouse office, and told Elena to hold my calls for the next hour. The war was over, and I had won. But there was still one loose end remaining, one final twist of the knife that I hadn't seen coming. The immediate aftermath of a war never looks the way you think it will. In movies, there is soaring music, a parade, a dramatic collapse into the arms of a loved one. In reality, when you finally cut the cancerous cord of a toxic family, there is only silence. A vast, echoing, ringing silence. After the heavy glass doors of Conference Room A slid shut, sealing the fate of the Bishop family and banishing them from my kingdom forever, I walked back to my corner office. Elena was standing by my desk. She didn't ask questions. She simply handed me a crystal tumbler with 2 fingers of exceptionally expensive bourbon. Neat. I cleared your schedule until tomorrow morning, Mile, she said softly. The Silicon Valley call has been rescheduled. Your driver is waiting downstairs whenever you are ready to go home. Thank you, Elena, I murmured, taking the glass. I stood by my window for a long time, watching the sun begin to dip below the jagged horizon of Manhattan, casting long, bruised shadows of purple and gold across the Hudson River. I took a sip of the bourbon, letting the burn anchor me to the present. I had spent 9 years running from the ghosts of Quentin and Larissa Bishop. I had built an impenetrable fortress of wealth, status, and ruthless corporate strategy, all to ensure they could never touch me again. But watching them standing in my boardroom, begging, lying, and finally breaking, I realized something profound. I hadn't just outrun them. I had completely outgrown them. They were not the towering, terrifying figures of my childhood who held the power to grant or withhold my existence. They were just 2 desperate, deeply flawed people trapped in a prison of their own making. Larissa would spend the rest of her life suffocating under the weight of her neighbor's judgment when the bank finally foreclosed on their pristine house. Quentin would go to his grave believing the world had cheated him, completely blind to the fact that his own arrogance and greed had dug his financial grave. I didn't hate them anymore. Hate requires emotional investment. What I felt for them now was a cool, clinical indifference. The exact same indifference they had shown me for 22 years. The universe has a strange, poetic way of balancing its ledgers. I left the office an hour later, taking the private elevator down to the subterranean garage where my town car was waiting. The drive back to Tribeca was a blur of city lights and the muted hum of evening traffic. When I unlocked the door to my penthouse, the quiet enveloped me like a heavy cashmere blanket. My home was a sanctuary of minimalist luxury, white leather, polished concrete, and walls of glass overlooking the city that never sleeps. It was a space that I owned, entirely and unequivocally. No one could take it from me. No one could forge my signature on a bank account to steal it. I poured myself a glass of Cabernet, kicked off my stilettos, and sank into the deep sofa. I closed my eyes, letting the exhaustion of the day finally wash over me. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a deep, aching soreness in my bones. At 10:45 p.m., my personal cell phone buzzed on the glass coffee table. It wasn't my work phone. Only a handful of people in the world had this number. I opened my eyes and looked at the screen. The caller ID was a string of digits I didn't recognize, but the area code was unmistakable. Pennsylvania. My thumb hovered over the red decline button. It was probably Quentin, calling from a burner phone or a hotel room, gearing up for round 2 of his desperate manipulation. Or Larissa, ready to hurl a barrage of guilt trips about how I was destroying the family. But something in my gut, that same instinct that had told me to read the Department of Defense clauses in the Veritas contract, told me to answer. I swiped the green icon and brought the phone to my ear. I didn't say hello. I just listened. For a moment, there was only the sound of heavy, ragged breathing on the other end of the line, and then a voice spoke. It wasn't angry, it wasn't demanding, it was just unimaginably tired. Mael? It was Hayes. I kept my voice perfectly neutral. If Quentin put you up to this to beg for the loan, Hayes, you can hang up right now. My answer is permanent. No, Hayes said quickly, his voice cracking slightly. No. Dad doesn't know I'm calling. He and Mom are at the hotel bar right now, blaming the economy, blaming you, blaming everyone but themselves. I stepped out. I just needed to talk to you. Just you. I took a slow sip of my wine. You have exactly 2 minutes, Hayes. Talk. There was a long pause. I could hear the faint, ambient noise of New York traffic in the background of his call. He was standing on a street corner somewhere in Midtown, looking up at the same sky I was. I never apologized to you, Hayes said, the words tumbling out of his mouth in a rush. For the graduation, for the money, for all of it. For 22 years of taking up all the air in the room. I closed my eyes. You were a child, Hayes. Quentin and Larissa set the rules of that house. You just played the game they built for you. But I knew, Mael, I wasn't stupid. I saw the way they treated you. I saw you eating leftovers before your night shifts while Dad bought me $400 bats I didn't even need. I saw them ignore your report cards. I saw it all, and I never said anything because I was too much of a coward to rock the boat. I liked being the favorite, until I didn't. I sat up slightly, placing my wine glass on the table. What do you mean, until you didn't? Hayes let out a hollow, bitter laugh. Dad told you today that I blew out my shoulder my sophomore year, right? That I lost the scholarship and ruined his master plan to save the family? Yes, I heard him. Mael, I didn't blow out my shoulder by accident. The words hung in the air, heavy and loaded with a devastating truth. I stopped breathing for a second. What are you saying? I was pitching in a meaningless scrimmage game, Hayes confessed, his voice dropping to a desperate whisper. My arm was tired. It had been hurting for months, but Dad wouldn't let me rest. He told the coaches to keep playing me. He kept talking about the scouts, the draft, the signing bonus that was going to pay off the second mortgage he took out on the house. I was 19 years old, and I was carrying the entire financial survival of our family on my right arm. He paused, swallowing hard. I could hear the phantom weight of that pressure in his voice. I stood on that mound, Mael, and I realized that if I made it to the majors, I would never be free. I would be Dad's ATM for the rest of my life. He would manage my money, Mom would manage my image, and I would just be a dancing monkey in a baseball uniform. So, I threw the hardest, ugliest slider of my life. I twisted my arm in a way I knew the physical therapist had explicitly warned me against. I felt the rotator cuff tear. I heard it pop. A chill ran down my spine. The golden child hadn't fallen from grace. He had deliberately amputated his own wings just to escape the cage. You crippled yourself on purpose, I whispered. The sheer psychological horror of our parents' expectations finally laid bare. It was the only way they would let me stop, Hayes said, his voice breaking. And the worst part? When the doctors told Dad I would never pitch competitively again, he didn't ask if I was in pain. He didn't hug me. He walked out of the hospital room and kicked a trash can. The moment I stopped being a financial asset, I became a disappointment. I became invisible to them, too. I leaned back against the leather sofa, staring blindly at the ceiling. The tragedy of the Bishop family was complete. Larissa and Quentin hadn't loved either of us. They loved the image of me being independent so they didn't have to parent, and they loved the image of Hayes being a star so they didn't have to work. We were never children to them. We were just utilities. Why are you telling me this now, Hayes? I asked softly. Because of the day you left, he replied. The day I came home from that Florida showcase, the one they stole your money for, I found out you were gone. I saw Mom crying over the note you left on the counter, the bank receipt. I saw what they did to you. He took a shaky breath. Mom lied to the neighborhood, Hayes continued. She made up that stupid story about Paris, but I knew the truth. I knew you had packed your car and driven into the unknown with nothing but $14 just to get away from the poison. You were so brave, Mael. You were the strongest person in that house. You leaving, it showed me that escape was possible. It gave me the courage to throw that pitch a year later and end my own nightmare. I wanted you to know that you were my hero, not the other way around. A single hot tear spilled over my lower lash line, tracking a slow path down my cheek. I hadn't cried in 9 years. I hadn't cried when I was freezing in Queens, or when Bradley Sterling tried to frame me, or when I made my first $1 million. But hearing my brother, the boy who was supposed to be my rival, the boy who had inadvertently stolen my graduation day, validate my pain and acknowledge my strength, it unlocked a door inside me that I didn't even know was rusted shut. I'm sorry they broke you, Hayes, I said, my voice thick with an emotion I couldn't completely suppress. They didn't break me entirely, he said softly. I'm a high school history teacher now, Mael. I make $40,000 a year. I drive a beat-up Honda, just like the one you left in. But I like my life. I have a fiance who doesn't care about country clubs. I'm okay. But after today, seeing how they tried to use you, I'm cutting them off too. I'm done. I'm letting them go bankrupt, and I'm walking away. I smiled through the tears. It was a genuine, beautiful smile. It's terrifying at first, the walking away part, but the air gets so much easier to breathe. I believe you, Hayes said. I saw your office. I saw you. You're magnificent, Mael. I won't bother you again. I know you've built a new life, but I just wanted to say goodbye, and thank you. Goodbye, Hayes. Take care of yourself. You too, sis. The line clicked dead. I lowered the phone to my lap. I sat in the silence of my penthouse, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the distant wail of a siren miles below. The Bishop family was truly gone. The ghosts had all been put to rest. But this time, it didn't feel like an amputation. It felt like a healing. The next morning, I walked into the offices of Vanguard Strategic Advisors at 7 a.m. The trading floors were quiet, the sun just beginning to stream through the eastern windows, catching the dust motes in the air. I didn't go to my desk. I walked straight to Eleanor Reed's office. She was already there, reviewing a thick stack of legal briefs, sipping black coffee. She looked up as I entered. Mael, I heard about the uninvited guests in conference room A yesterday. Elena handled the security protocols perfectly. Is everything managed? It is permanently managed, Eleanor, I said, taking a seat opposite her, but it gave me an idea, a project I want Vanguard to back. Eleanor arched a silver eyebrow, putting her pen down. I'm listening. I want to establish a philanthropic arm of this firm, I said, my voice ringing with absolute certainty. Specifically, an educational foundation. I am going to seed it with $2 million of my personal equity, and I want Vanguard to match it. Eleanor leaned back, studying me. We are a crisis management firm, Mael, not a charity. Philanthropy is the ultimate crisis prevention, I countered smoothly, knowing exactly how to speak her language. It provides massive tax deductions, unparalleled positive PR for the firm, and it builds loyalty. But more importantly, it's personal. I leaned forward, placing my hands on her desk. I want to call it the Helen Callahan Foundation. It will provide full ride, unconditional, no strings attached collegiate scholarships to first-generation female students, specifically women who have no financial backing from their families, women who are working night shifts in diners just to pay for textbooks, women who are trying to navigate the predatory fine print of federal student loans completely alone. Eleanor looked at me, her piercing gray eyes softening just a fraction of a millimeter. She didn't know the exact details of my past. She didn't need to, but she was smart enough to read the subtext. She saw the 22-year-old girl sitting in a graduation gown in a sweltering Honda Civic staring at a stolen $2,000. You want to catch them before they fall, Eleanor said quietly. No, I replied, a fierce, protective fire burning in my chest. I want to teach them how to read the fine print so nobody can ever push them over the edge in the first place. I want to build an army of women who know how to survive the monsters in the room. Eleanor Reed smiled. It was a rare, beautiful, terrifying smile. She picked up her heavy Mont Blanc pen and uncapped it. Draft the charter, Mael. You have your matching funds. A year later, the Helen Callahan Foundation awarded its first 20 full-ride scholarships. I stood on a stage in a glittering banquet hall in Manhattan, looking out at 20 young women holding acceptance letters that guaranteed their tuition, their housing, and their freedom. They were crying, their friends were cheering. I looked at their faces and I saw myself, but they wouldn't have to spend a decade freezing in a walk-up apartment to earn their seat at the table. They wouldn't have to become invisible to survive. I had built the safety net that Quentin and Larissa Bishop had set on fire. That night, after the gala, I returned to my penthouse. I changed out of my designer gown and slipped into a soft silk robe. I poured a glass of wine and stepped out onto my private terrace. The wind was sharp and cold, carrying the electric, metallic scent of the city. I leaned against the glass railing, looking down at the millions of lights stretching out across the grid of Manhattan. Somewhere out there, in the dark corners of the country, there were families sitting in glass houses pretending everything was perfect, while they suffocated the people they were supposed to love. Somewhere, there were daughters learning to be small, learning to be quiet, learning to apologize for taking up space. But not me. Not anymore. I had taken the trauma of my invisibility and weaponized it into an empire. I had taken the cruelty of my parents and used it as the mortar to build a life of absolute, unassailable independence. I didn't need Quentin's money. I didn't need Larissa's fake country club pride. I didn't even need their apologies. Blood is just biology. Family is the people who stand by you when you are holding nothing but a $14 bank balance. Family is Eleanor Reed giving me the keys to the kingdom because she respected my mind. Family is Elena guarding my door. Family is the 20 young women whose futures I had just secured. I took a sip of my wine, the complex flavors bursting on my tongue. I looked up at the moon, hanging heavy and bright over the skyline. Mael Bishop died in a parking lot 9 years ago, but Mael Callahan was alive. She was powerful, she was free, and she would never, ever be invisible again. Thank you so much for listening to Maelle's journey. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever had to walk away from the people who are supposed to protect you in order to protect yourself, please let me know in the comments. You are not alone, and your strength is your greatest asset. Please hit that subscribe button, like this video, and share it with someone who might need a reminder of their own power today. I'll see you in the next story.